Welcome, everyone. This is Trey on this 15th day of October 2016. It's a Saturday, and I'm here with my friend Joe Creason, and we are here to discuss the topic of suffering. Welcome, Joe.
How's it going?
Good. Now, I can't remember. Would you mind telling me a little bit about yourself again?
Sure.
Hold on just a minute. I got two things going. Okay. You have some educational background that's fairly impressive, do you not?
Yeah, I don't think it's really relevant to this. I have a master's in anthropology. That's about it.
Oh no, I think it matters a lot. I mean, just the fact that you have an education is impressive.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I had a terrible memory, but we had some discussion, and I think there was something on Facebook that went out, and I had a hangout. Was it with Britland, I guess? And we were talking about this similar topic, and you had posted some video of a guy, and you felt like Britland hadn't pushed me enough, that he was going the right direction, but didn't go there. And so
yeah.
I wanted to, so we'll just pick it up from there, and I'll say, in immortal words of the venerable Pat Benatar, give me your best shot, or hit me with your best shot.
Well, yeah, it's probably a good idea to start out, given the background. The whole thing is, when you're giving the problem of pain and suffering, the argument is essentially, if God exists, then gratuitous pain and suffering would not exist. Gratuitous pain and suffering does exist. We can definitely get into that. And also just look around you. There's a lot of it. Therefore, probably God doesn't exist. And usually what happens, you and I, we go back and forth whether or not this is pain and suffering, whether or not there's what are called theodicies, defenses, that show that this isn't pain and suffering, or God has a good or justified reason for allowing it. And eventually we get to, well, we're not sure if God has good reasons for allowing this pain. We just aren't in an epistemic position to know that. So for all we know, God does have a good reason for allowing such pain and suffering that you and I would clearly identify as gratuitous. But we're just not aware of that. And that is what's called skeptical theism. And it's kind of a tactic that's actually been put forth in the literature on philosophy of religion. And it's something that I think actually, it's not a turn you want to do. I think it actually leads to just a complete hornet's nest of trouble for the theist if they say that we don't have any access to God's moral intentions, because it means a lot of problems. You don't have access to whether or not God has certain intentions that could render things like the Bible as being a false text. Because for all you know, God wanted to deceive people with the Bible in order to meet some moral, theological aim that we just don't have access to. That's what you could say if you're a skeptical theist. And I don't think Christians, I don't think anyone else who's religious want to say that, right?
Yeah. Well, I think you would, in the video that you posted, the fellow in the video, who was it?
Stephen Law.
Stephen Law had a part of his skeptical theism. Part of that explanation was the idea of noceums. This is what I was speaking with Britland. We were talking about the same thing. I said I never posited a noceum category. In other words, not only do I say that there is a demonstrable purpose in suffering, I would assert that you do as well. And I think there's a story told of Stephen Hawking, who said before he had ALS, I think something like he drank too much, he smoked too much, and just lived life kind of recklessly. And then once he got ALS, he saw the glory of a sunset, and it slowed him down. And he thought, wow. And all I need to give any justification is to say that there is such a thing as benefit from suffering. And I've never spoken with an atheist, and I've asked this many times. I've never never seen a skeptic whom I've asked this question where I said, has something ever bad happened in your life and it turned out for your benefit? Have you ever had that happen?
Sure.
Okay, everybody has. So if that is true, then the whole no-seum category is debunked right there. All I need is one safe thing. And I don't even go to safe part to say, every time you go to a movie, unless it's like a documentary or something, every time it has a plot line, it has a protagonist, an antagonist, a conflict, a climax, and a resolution. Okay? The reason you go to that movie is to see the triumph over evil. And the end result is you are a better person for having gone to that movie, because that's why you went. You went because of the sanctity of existence. You went to better your life. And of course, it may have been a bad movie. You may have been disappointed, but you went for that very purpose. So to say that there's no, we can't see anything that evil doesn't, no benefit that evil gives is patently false.
The thing with that is that we're stepping back a bit. You're still giving theodicies. This is a theodicy that you're giving. That God's
yes.
So we're actually you're not really addressing the Pandora's box objection that Stephen Law gave. We're not there just yet. You don't think you have to commit to skeptical theism just yet. You think that the evil that's being seen is there to allow more good later. To either you're saying it's so we can appreciate the good things in life, like with Stephen Hawking, or it's a bad situation that ends up leading to a bunch of good, that kind of thing. That's a theodicy. You're not necessarily committing to skeptical theism. The problem with that, though, is you could say that about any instance, and you can also say, well, just wait until the good comes, like something like the Holocaust, all the horrible atrocities. You could say there's probably some good coming from that, some good that's going to outweigh that bad. But it seems to me like you're kind of diminishing the importance of what we're taking from the Holocaust, of the suffering that's occurred. You're diminishing any type of suffering that someone goes through by just saying, well, there's going to be some good later.
No, what you're exalting the sanctity of existence. That's the question that needs to be asked. Why are you saying there's such a thing as evil? I don't care if it's I know like people say, oh, I'm doing an internal critique and it doesn't matter to me. No, in order to make the complaint, you've got to assume the standard. Otherwise, there is no complaint.
I'm not.
Why is
assume the standard of what's evil?
You're saying there's such a thing as evil, right?
Well, I could stay with pain and suffering, but if you want to go with evil,
okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm fine with that. There's such a thing as pain and suffering, and you view pain and suffering as being bad, which is morality. It's evil.
Well, there's a couple ways you can view it. You could view it as bad. It's immoral in a lot of moral frameworks, but then there's also it's inconsistent with the concept of God. And
inconsistency is bad, right?
Well, it's inconsistent, but you could say whether or not that's bad. Something could be inconsistent.
But inconsistency, yes, but you're assuming inconsistency is evil, right?
Well, you could say it's evil if you're using like a framework where inconsistency would lead to something like the moral evils that we're talking about, but it's not evil if you give an incorrect answer to a math problem, right?
Okay, then why are you complaining?
I'm not complaining. I'm just pointing out that if you want to say you have a God who has these attributes, who's omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and then square that God with the gratuitous amounts of pain and suffering in the world, you have to be aware of the fact that it's going to come off as like just staggeringly inconsistent.
Right. So you're saying inconsistency is bad, and also you're assuming gratuitous suffering. You're not demonstrating it.
Well, yeah, we can get into that. Like, for example, like there's hundreds, thousands, millions, even billions of years of animal suffering that has happened even before humans came about. That seems like just that. I'm sorry.
I'm a young Earth creationist.
Even thousands of years, though. Even if you think the Earth is only 6,000 years old, thousands of years of animals going through the circle of life before humans
why is there
even
suffering?
came. I'm sorry.
Why is there suffering from my perspective?
Well, what is the reason for such pain and suffering?
Sin.
I guess that's something sin. What did animals do to deserve sin?
Are you saying there is some system of justice whereby it's unjust for animals to suffer?
No, I'm just asking you why animals are like why do animals also have to suffer for sin? Because isn't it humans who sin?
It is humans who sin, but there are, we call it, like collateral damage that happens when people do things, and the entire world was thrown into an entropic state, which includes animal suffering by the sin of mankind. Is that unjust or something?
The
again,
collateral damage is usually kind of a bad thing, is it not? It's usually an unjust thing to have collateral damage in a situation. The thing about it, it's not only bad that it occurs, but it's inconsistent with a being who is divinely resourceful. God, I can only assume that something that's omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent would figure out a way to have us learn from the concept of sin without having collateral damage, without having animals rip each other apart for thousands of years.
Okay. That is an argument saying, I wouldn't do it that way, therefore it's false. However, when you say that people are, when you say God is omnibenevolent, I remember with Britman when I had that hangout, it's like, we're not agreeing on what the term omnibenevolence means. I don't even know what that term means from your perspective, but it seems to be, same with Britman, just some kind of thing that says God is always happy, clappy, there's no wrath, there's no justice with him. And I can't even conceive of that from a Christian worldview.
Well, that's a good point. We should try and flesh out these terms. What do you mean? Do you think that calling God omnibenevolent would be correct?
What I'm gonna interpret omnibenevolent to be is omnibenevolence is that which gives him the most glory. So first of all, the two great commandments in Christianity are love the Lord God with thy heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, Jesus said, on all these rest the law and the prophets. Everything based on those two things. So our moral code ultimately is rooted in his glory, and to love him and to glorify him. So omnibenevolence for me is just saying that God is consistent with his nature, which is even logically necessary.
Yeah, but you and I are consistent with our nature. You're not really telling me that much. If you're saying that God is consistent with his nature, that's why he's that's consistent with omnibenevolence. You and I are consistent with our nature, right?
Yes.
So what do you mean when you say God, what is it? I wrote this down. Omnibenevolence is something being consistent with giving God the most glory. And that's based off of him being consistent with his nature. But I can say that about me. I could say omnibenevolence is something that's consistent with giving me the most glory, and the reason why is because it has to be consistent with my nature.
That's right.
You're not really saying anything when you say.
But you're a contingent being, and you have fallibility among you, but if in fact you are self-existent and you are indeed existence itself, then you must be consistent with yourself. Omnibenevolence would just be, that's just what is. And I agree that you sound like you're not saying anything, but we can't do that because we're dependent creatures and we have moral imperative and we have secondary causality as a part of our existence. God does not. So you can't make a direct correlation to that.
But I don't see why, because we're contingent and he's necessary. I don't see why that makes the difference exactly.
Because we're fallible and he's not. In other words, we make mistakes. We do not. We are dependent in our nature. So I can't say, oh, good is just whatever I do. No, I am dependent upon him. He is the one that commands me what I must do. I don't command what I must do. And my glory is not the center of all things.
So God just doesn't make mistakes.
He can't make mistakes. Otherwise, he would be dependent by his definition. He would depend on that which gave him the new information or from which he learned. He can't learn anything.
I mean, it seems to me like, okay, you could posit such a God, but positing such a God means that you can't posit God as being a personal God.
Are you personal?
I'm sorry?
Are you personal?
I'm a person, I guess. I act as an agent, right?
Okay, so
is that something that's only consistent with being contingent, acting like an agent?
Say it again.
It can only contingent entities can only they act as an agent. Could you identify another necessary entity, and that necessary entity could not fail at anything, just like how God can't fail at anything?
I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. There can't be. We just had this. Were you at that discussion?
I was there, but I wasn't. I was just listening.
No,
and I'm not saying that. I'm not trying to go down the route that there are other necessary things. I'm just wondering if that's something that's consistent with being necessary.
No, there can only be one necessary being, logically speaking, and ontologically as well. So to posit another necessary being does not comport with rationality, because its attributes must be the fullness of all that is. And if something else has the fullness of all it is, when you're talking about you're saying the same ontology, and they must be identical. It's two of the same being, but then you're talking about one being, so it must collapse back into one.
Fullness of all that there is. I'm not sure what. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Okay, so. Okay, I tried to explain this if people don't understand. We talked about the accidental features, it's like I am a part of the category of humanness. Okay, and when I am, when the Sperm and Ovum unite to make me, I am following a formal principle of humanity. In other words, that information is encoded in that which is going, and I'm not going to grow up and be an elephant, because I have humanity is my formal nature. So if something, so what I do is I gain things and I lose things. Like I can gain knowledge and I can lose knowledge, but I am not the perfection of knowledge. So for God, he doesn't change in whatever he is. So there's an exact identity between his being and his existence. My existence is something that's given to me. I am a human, but you could say, what am I, and whether I am or whether I am not. All right, so I am a human, and I can either exist or not exist. God is necessary in his existence, so his being and his existence are exactly the same thing. And so everything that he is in perfection. There's no fallibility in it. So his knowledge is perfect, his power is perfect, and he doesn't pass from states to existence. So for example, you move from one level of knowledge to another, or you move from one level of emotion to another. I can say right now, you are happy. You have that accidental quality. That's a quality that you have about yourself that if you don't have it, you still don't lose your being. All right, you still don't stop becoming a human if you're not happy. But let's say you're happy right now. That is an accidental quality that you have moved into, and then when something external outside of you acts upon you to make you unhappy, or works within your body, makes you unhappy, then you move to a state of sadness. But for God, in his perfection, since he is pure act, he is pure actuality, he is the perfection of all that he is, he doesn't move from one state to another. If he moved from one state to another, then he would be dependent upon that which brings that change of quality within him, and he would be contingent by definition.
I'm trying to think. Again, I don't see how this could make God personal. It seems like you're describing God in terms of being in terms of the concept of divine simplicity.
Yes,
but if God, but even theologians agree that this would render God into some sort of property. This would render God.
Not very good theologians like Alvin Plantinga. He's
you don't
weak
think
on
he's
this.
not a very? Oh, okay, all right.
Not on that
Go
issue.
ahead.
Not on it. He's very bad on his theology proper. In fact, it's horrific. This is something that's been lost. All right. So when we had the Enlightenment occurred, and we moved from Aristotelian physics to early modern physics, there was a great improvement as we can look at, say, how one physical bit reacts to another physical bit and how they interact. And that's how we look at a causality. And that's a great thing because it helps us to build things a lot better than we could under Aristotelian physics. However, I think we threw the baby out with the bathwater when we threw out formal cause and final cause. Those were thrown out of the mix of the fourfold causality of Aristotle. So when we, at that time, and also with Immanuel Kant, really, when Kant came in, he basically put God in the numeral realm, said we cannot know anything, so metaphysics were thrown out the window. There was a great shift. I mean, it's called the Kantian Revolution for a reason. There's a great shift in the way everything was looked at, and I think it was a travesty. A lot of stuff was lost. And so, for example, you look at the scientific community today, and they're utterly, I won't say ignorant, they're stupid when it comes to philosophy. And of course, there's some gaining back of that. But even in theology, with the advent of Kant, Kant says you can't know these things, therefore you must just take it in faith. Many theologians fell at his feet, and I would say, it's my opinion, I might make somebody mad here, that presuppositionalism, they would get so mad at me saying this, but they have fallen dead at the feet of Immanuel Kant. And they've given up, said, "Oh, we just got to accept it. You just assume it. And I think that's wrong. I think that there is much to be regained by going back. In fact, I think we should have a new renaissance in philosophy and going back and looking at the ancient Greeks and don't take everything they say, but learning from them again. And it'll enable us. That Plankton is one of those guys. The doctrine of simplicity is just now being regained. In fact, it's in my church. My church's Association of Reformed Baptist Churches of America that are, I think, are on the forefront of this, and a lot of Presbyterians are on with it too. But a lot of very popular theologian, William Lane Craig, is horrific. He's terrible on these things. Rob Lister, there's several men that are very popular. Bruce Ware, who was an evangelical, very famous, that are really, really bad on these issues. And it's important. We're regaining this, but it's important that we look historically why they had these ideas. They're not very deep thinkers when it comes to these issues, and that's what I want. I want to know I want to get to the substance, and I want to look at the history and learn from it. And I think we're regaining that now.
Yeah, but Plantinga and Craig, they both have different reasons. They both share one reason, is that they think that God is a personal being.
Yeah,
and they don't
that's
think
the problem.
they don't hold on. They don't think that squares with divine simplicity. Craig also thinks that God is free, and he actually takes on the property of being temporal when he creates the universe.
Yes.
So that's why he doesn't want divine simplicity.
Yes. Boy, you're pretty smart. That's amazing. You know that.
I know this stuff. Don't worry. Well, because divine simplicity, people will affirm it, and then they'll try and run William Lane Craig's arguments, and they don't realize that William Lane Craig doesn't like divine simplicity because he thinks that temporality is an accidental property of God.
Yes. And he took it on. He stopped being eternal at the moment he created.
Yeah, exactly.
And I would place him in the category of almost being he's a theistic personalist too, as a tritheist. I am so against William Lane Craig. I don't know that he's a Christian myself personally. I think he is so off in his doctrine of God that it's just something that can't even be overlooked. It's really bad. Plantinga, not so much so. They're not the same way. They both deny simplicity, but I'm more gracious with Plantinga. But not with Craig, man. And that guy, his Molinism, he is just he's a philosopher first and a theologian second, and he has he's a smart guy, but his theology is horrific, just really bad.
Yeah, he's a very smart guy. You're also against his Molinism. Like a lot of, even with divine simplicity, a lot of it is he needs libertarian free will for the Kalam to work. So I assume you don't accept libertarian free will?
No, I'm a compatibilist. No,
okay.
He says God has got to deal with the cards that he's been dealt. Now think about that. If he's God, who's dealing the cards to him?
Yeah, that's not. Yeah,
it's just ridiculous. I mean, on face, I just think, how can people believe this stuff?
Well, wait a minute. Do you think that God has free will? You think he has like what we would call libertarian free will? He has the ability to choose otherwise?
I don't know about. I know that he is who he is according to his nature. But of course, if he were determined by something other than himself, then he would not be
He wouldn't
God.
he wouldn't be necessary either.
Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah.
But when you say he is, it seems like he is contingent. He's contingent on his own nature, right?
Well, he is who he is. I mean, it's not like it's. For example, there's certain things God can't do. God cannot deny himself. He cannot. Otherwise, again, it would show fallibility and inability, and he would be contingent by definition. So the nature itself has its qualities that are definitional to who he is, but it's not like, again, with simplicity, there's not something outside of God making God to be God.
Hmm. But with free will, though, it seems like he's dependent on his nature. But that's what you would say for someone who doesn't have free will. They can't help themselves due to their nature.
Well, and think about this, Joe. I mean, God lives in a realm of pure being. There is no predication, and this is why it's an incommunicable attribute. Everything that we do is by way of predication. We cannot even think a simple thought because our thought is a becoming in and of itself. So that's why we have to use analogical language and anthropomorphisms and anthropopathisms. When God, talking about God having parting the seas with a blast of his nostrils doesn't mean he has a big nose. It means he's taken on personal property so that we can relate to him. Yeah, in other words, he has to speak with becoming language in order to relate to us. Otherwise, that's what analogical language is. Otherwise, there's no connection to us.
And so the language that we use in order to describe whether or not God has free will is because it's analogical. Ultimately, we can't really know whether or not he has free will. I'm not.
Well, no, how God makes choice in eternity when choice for us is something moving from one point to the other, we can understand that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but why use the word choice if it's not helpful in allowing us to understand God?
Well, every piece of language we're going to have is analogical. It's not univocal. We cannot have univocal understanding with God because it's incommunicable. It's not possible for us to understand. Like I said, we can't even think of simple thought because we are becoming. This is my complaint with Craig with God. Can you imagine? He says when God created, he became temporal. So here he is. He's unchanging. Nothing can affect him, and all of a sudden he makes himself to be a happening being. It's just so stupid. I just don't understand how a man can have and it's so funny because all the apologists, the marquee apologists, everybody thinks they're so great, Wayne Lane Craig and JP Morrell stuff, Mike Licona. To me, I just like, and then there's this little guy named James White. You know who he is?
Yeah, I know who James White is. Okay,
James White to me is probably the greatest Christian apologist alive. Nobody, his little two-man ministry, he's down there putzing along on his little bicycle, but I consider him to be the very best. But nobody knows who he is.
I'd like to see him take on more atheists, though. The only time I've seen him take on atheists is on the resurrection, because I think Shermer.
He was supposed to do Hitchens, and Hitchens got sick right before.
On whether or not God exists, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Because I've only seen him debate the resurrection or other like internal stuff, like the Trinity, that kind of stuff.
Well, and he did. I just listened to this. Who's the Jesus Seminar guy? Robert Price. Robert
Price. Yeah, I've seen that, but again, that's just the resurrection.
Well, right? it was the scriptures. Yeah, I think so.
Or script. Yeah, you're right.
Regarding Christian things, and of course, my complaint with James White is he calls himself a presuppositionalist, and he uses that terminology. But when you interact with him, what do you think, Joe? Do you think he acts like a presuppositionalist?
No, but I think that's kind of more old school. I think that Bonson was similar too. Bonson was willing to talk about, evidential claims and stuff. It seems like presup is like the Alamo for some theologians.
Yeah, I think so too.
If they can't get you on evidential arguments, they retreat to the they get to
Oh,
the Alamo.
oh no,
And
they're
then
two
they say,
completely different streams. I mean, people who are presuppositionalists, they're going to generally going to be reformed. Most reformed guys are presuppositionalists, and evidentialists are usually Arminians.
yeah,
And I'm something different. I'm classicist. I'm evidentialists are all about probability. Presuppositionalists is all about certainty.
yeah.
I'm a guy who looks at evidences, but I'm all about certainty as well. And my argument for the existence of God is a certain one. If in fact you give my two foundations of law of non-contradiction and sense perception.
We were talking about divine simplicity, right? Divine simplicity, and well, it's just when you affirm divine simplicity, you're saying that this attribute of God is the same as this attribute. You're saying that his omnibenevolence is his omnipotence, is his omniscience, is his love, is his glory, is all these attributes of God. It seems like I don't understand how every time you mention a specific part of God, you can't just end it with saying, but ultimately we don't know. We're using analogical language. And so it doesn't seem like you really are saying anything when you do talk about his different attributes on divine simplicity.
Well, here's what God does is you're right, they must all collapse at some point into the perfect unity. However, the analogy that James Dolezal uses, he's got a
James who?
Dolezal, Dolezal. He's the guy that I got most of my theology proper from. He spoke at our Southern California Reformed Baptist Pastors Conference last year, and it's excellent. There's a series there. But he came out with a book called God Without Parts. And on the cover, he has it, and I think Augustine and both Aquinas use the example of God being like pure white light and refracting through a prism. In other words, he takes himself and refracts it through accommodation for us so that we can understand. Because there's no other way for us to understand it. So in other words, he makes it, he predicates himself through analogical language so that we can gain some touch point of communication.
Yeah, but every time you start talking about this, or every time someone who affirms divine simplicity starts talking about this, and you get down to the nitty-gritty, it does just end up being, well, it's analogical language. That's why this confusion you're having is a confusion. But it seems like there's nothing we can know for certain then.
Okay, well, you're right. And so we got to have three categories. I don't know if you heard me talk this before, but there's paradox, there's contradiction, and there's mystery. Okay.
And there's mystery?
Yeah. So paradox is something that looks like a contradiction upon further examination. Jesus said you must, if you want to save your life, you must lose it. You're thinking, that doesn't make any sense. And you think about it for a minute, it says in one sense and a different one sense in another, And then so that's a paradox, something that appears to be contradictory, but upon closer examination is reconcilable. Then you've got contradiction, where something is truly contradiction. Something is and is not at the same time, same relationship. And then finally, you've got mystery. You've got that, which that we don't understand, but it doesn't violate any laws of logic. And that's necessary with God. If in fact there is his being is incommunicable, then there's got to be mystery. So you can't sit there and say, well, because I don't understand everything, I don't understand anything. That's not helpful. But what we've got to do is we've got to be able to embrace mystery, but we've got to repel intellectual repulsiveness or rational repulsiveness. In other words, contradiction. So in other words, if you were to say, well, Trey, since you say everything collapses into one with God, therefore we can't say anything about him, and we're going to inquire about metaphysics, and we're going to look at what we are, the one thing that is most repulsive to that is to say that somehow we existed and not existed at the same time in the same relationship. You see what I'm saying? There's a hierarchy that we're following, and my mystery is at the very top, where I push as far as I can. Whereas those who are against me, their contradiction is way at the bottom. And that's not acceptable because there's no inquiry.
It's not so much that I'm saying we can't understand anything. It's that I'm asking you what is something that we can say about God, but then it won't just come down to, well, we ultimately don't know.
Well, presuppositions that we've got to have are the via causalitatis, which is say that there is a causal relationship that we can relate to them in some measure. And then you've got the via negationis, which is the main way we speak about God. It's apophatic theology, speaking of God negatively, say what he is not. He is invisible. He's immutable. And so the majority of our theology proper is going to be cataphatic because we're basically removing saying what he is not, because we can't necessarily affirm and understand what he is. But then there's the via, gosh, what's it called? It's the way of perfection. In other words, if you're saying God is something, making some kind of a affirmation about him, you're saying that whatever it is that he has, he must be the perfection of it because he is pure act.
So whatever. Okay, so he's insurpassable in any possible like attribute.
Well, logically,
whatever
he
it
has
is.
to be.
Okay.
He's got to be perfection of it. He can't be a partiality of it or something, because that will.
If God has anything, he has the best of it. If God is loving,
okay.
Yeah.
So what are passions in us? Here's another quote. What are passions in us? Say love and anger and justice, whatever that we feel in our hearts. What are passions in us? Are perfections in God. Like I said, because we move from those states from one to another. That's what we say God is impassible. This is guys like William Lane Craig said they hate the idea to say that God is impassible, but you were quoting, planting us saying, well, God just makes God a super property. No, he's not a super property. It's impersonal. He is the perfection of personhood. And everything about it's the exact opposite of what they say, I would say.
Yeah, but one of the fundamental things of being a person is the possibility of failure, I think. The way you can identify the actions of a person, I think, is to be able to identify that their actions won't line up with their intentions.
Yeah.
But if God is perfect, then you won't be able to identify that. So we have no way of identifying whether or not God could be a person.
Well, we've got to go with what logically is necessary. If person, I mean, you affirm that you are a person, right?
Yeah.
How do you justify that?
Well, my intentions don't line up with my actions in all times.
And
like if I want to throw like a dart at a dartboard, and I go, my intention is to hit the bullseye. It's possible that I won't hit the bullseye. It's possible I'll hit the person sitting next to me, whatever. I won't hit the bullseye. My intentions don't track with my actions. But if God is perfect at everything, then we simply can't see that. God, if he intends to hit the bullseye, he's going to hit the bullseye. But how can you separate that from just lightning hitting a tree? A lightning doesn't fail to hit the tree, fail to hit hit the house next to it. It's just a causal disposition.
Yeah, but do you equate your volition with a lightning strike?
I don't know if it's necessarily my volition. There's differences between a lightning strike and my personal, I guess. There's difference between a lightning strike and what we would call our volition, right? When a lightning strikes, that's just a series of causal events. That's causal dispositions. So you wouldn't say that there's a barn, there's a tree, the lightning hits a tree. You wouldn't say that the lightning failed to hit the barn. That's not how you would talk about causal dispositions. It's these different causal activities resulted in the lightning hitting the tree. But when I'm doing things like I said, throwing darts at a dartboard, I can miss the bullseye. I can say that I failed to hit the bullseye. My intentions do not match the actions that I perform. But if God is infallible, right? If God can't fail to do anything, then how can you separate his activities from something like lightning hitting a tree?
Well, there's a couple of things I want to say, but what is the activity of God ad intra, which means as God as he is, not as he expresses himself and as he refracts himself into this world? How is God? What is it for God to do activity as pure act, where there's no passage of time?
Well, I'm not really sure what you mean by pure act, but I would imagine something like, having Jesus come down to earth, performing miracles, that kind of thing, that's activities.
Yes, but Jesus was contingent, his human nature.
Okay, but it's still part of God, is it not?
He's the person of God who takes on an additional nature. So we talked about this in the hangout the other day, that when God acts, though, God doesn't act as he can't. He doesn't act as act and patience. And patient. I mean, he's not being affected by that which he does. He's the one who gives to all but receives from none, I think Charnock said.
This seems to go against divine simplicity a whole lot, though. I mean, he becomes. I mean, he's taking on a new property, a
but it's
property
not
of
essential to
becoming.
him. It's not
What do
essential
you
to
mean?
him.
It's not essential. Jesus isn't essential to.
His human nature is not essential. It's an additional nature that is not. It doesn't define God before he made it.
How can God? Okay, if you're divinely simple, it's okay to take on non-essential properties.
Yes.
But isn't that an essential property of God that it's
No.
okay for him to take on? So it's not essential, but then, I mean, it seems like that's an essential property of God. He already has all his essential properties, but he could take on additional properties. That's essential to God's being, is it not?
No, it's not, because he is not defined by his human nature ad intra. It's something that he participates in and takes on, but it doesn't affect him as, like, for example, now I use the example of walking in the sand, where we get indentations on our feet from the sand. He makes the footprints, but he doesn't get indentations.
But I don't see how it's not taking on another attribute, only because it's not an essential attribute. So you're saying God becoming Jesus and coming down to earth isn't essential for God's
Right.
theological aims and goals.
Right.
He could have done it another way.
Could have done well. I don't know if he could have done another way. The way that everything is the way it is. I don't know. I don't know that.
It seems to me like it is essential for Jesus to have come down and for the atonement and everything. It seems essential
in the way that
to
he
when
has done it. Yes.
Yeah. But to say that, I mean, how would you decide that it's essential? How would it be essential that God became Jesus, came down to earth and everything? How would you be able to say that that's essential?
I'm saying, when I say it's essential, I'm not saying it's. I'm not saying that being. I think we're equivocating the term essential here. I'm talking about his human nature is not definitive eternally as to who he is. He's not defined. You know, before Jesus had a human nature, before God had a human nature in the person of Jesus, he was not lacking something before he had that nature in his being who he was.
It's not necessarily about not lacking anything. With divine simplicity, I think just showing that he takes on a new attribute, you don't have to imply that he was lacking that attribute. It's just the mere fact that he had to take on that new attribute that would negate the concept of divine simplicity. And it seems clear to me that Jesus, as a contingent being, like you said, being born in time, he's taking on, and then Jesus, the atonement, resurrecting, coming into heaven and everything, and with the concept of the Trinity, that's taking on a new attribute. He's taking on the attribute of Jesus, and that would go against divine simplicity.
No, he has interacted in this world, and that action is involving change within the realm in which we have. But he, in and of himself, is not dependent upon that human nature in order to be.
I don't think that. Again, I don't think that it's not that it's some sort of flaw in God's nature. It's just a flaw. It's just a problem with the concept of divine simplicity. You could still have God exist. It's just he's not divinely simple. So I think that right now I'm just trying to show that I don't think divine simplicity is going to work. And I think one of the ways you show that is by showing that clearly when he wants to perform the actions of Jesus and stuff, he's no longer divinely simple. He's taking on actions in time, which is something that an immutable, timeless, changeless entity as God, in terms of being divinely simple, cannot do.
Okay, well, and you sound like William Lane Craig very much so. So you're
I mean,
saying
that's
that,
one of the arguments that he uses, sure.
yeah. And he's very lonely in that camp. I don't know if you know that. Unless you're a follower of William Lane Craig, people don't generally hold to that.
Well, a lot of, I mean, divine simplicity it's still kind of particular to certain like theological perspectives.
It's called historic Christianity.
I think it's like, are Thomas, are they divine?
Yes.
That's usually what I've associated it with. But then
which
recently,
was just the church.
I've found more presuppositional apologists like actually kind of deferring to it. The other people who are into divine simplicity are people who want an answer to the Euthyphro dilemma. But yeah, I think that divine simplicity just becomes a mess for the theologian. Every time they talk about something that God does, every time they try and solve a theological puzzle, at the end of it, they have to say, well, ultimately, we don't know. We're just talking about it in terms of an analogy. We ultimately are unsure. But then it kind of makes a mockery of anyone trying to say they can speak about the reasons why God has allowed things, the reason why God doesn't allow things. It makes a mockery of things like what we started out with, a problem of pain and suffering. You can't really talk about God's reasons because I think you're talking about things that require change. They require thought. They require some sort of like foresight. But you can't talk about those kinds of things if God is divinely simple.
Again, I mean, I will defer once again to the concept of mystery. We certainly may have those things that we do not understand, but what we can't do is that which is logically repulsive. So again, I'm at the top of my tree and saying, yes, there is mystery. But from, I don't know where you stand, but people from your camp want to start out with contradiction at the base.
Okay. I'm not really, I'm sorry, I'm not seeing how that answers the problem that I'm having.
Okay. The problem that, see, if God must have a change, you're saying there must be a change in his being. To me, this is logically repulsive. To say that there's a change in God's being as he interacts with his contingent creation would say that God must somehow, in order to be a say, must be contingent. How does that work?
I mean, you're saying that it's wrong because it would go against the thing you're defending, but I mean, that's not really answering the question. That's like me saying, hey, you have to give a reason more than just saying, well, it's wrong because it would show that my position is wrong. Why is it the case that you can't just say, well, we don't have to worry about these things that would ruin my concept of a divinely simple God because they would ruin my concept of a divinely simple God?
No,
you're not really saying anything.
No, it would ruin my concept of thinking about metaphysics. In other words, I've got to go to complete agnosticism, which is where you're at, and irrationality.
Yeah, but I see you as being in complete agnosticism every time you talk about a different attribute of God.
No, because remember, my mystery is at the top. Yours is at the bottom. Your contradiction is at the bottom.
The contradiction that I'm showing in divine simplicity doesn't overcome the mysteriousness of divine simplicity.
No, when you're saying there's a contradiction, you're saying that divine simplicity must. Divine simplicity is the prerequisite for there being an ase being, okay? And you're saying ase being must be limited to not being able to interact with contingency. Contingency does not define God. God defines contingency. So you're coming to the conclusion where everything's backward.
No, but no, the thing about it is that God does interact with contingency. That's what he's doing when he's performing miracles,
Right.
when
And
he's having Jesus come about. So that seems to be contradictory to an immutable, changeless, timeless being.
Right. And so, but what I have to say is we affirm if it is changeless being, which is what is necessary for there to be a contingent existence, then you cannot say that it doesn't make sense because that being needs to be contingent in order to be ase. That's what you're saying.
Can you repeat that one more time?
Sure. What you're saying is that in order for it to be an ase being,
mm-hmm.
Since we have contingency, I mean, we all admit that we have the real world right here, at least me. Okay. And so since I require a creator, that creator, you're saying, must be contingent like me, but then, wait a minute, no, because he's got to be ase. In other words, whatever you're coming to, whatever conclusion you come to, you cannot violate the law of non-contradiction when defining aseity. And that's what you're trying to do. You're saying, well, since there's contingency and God must interact with contingency, therefore he must be patient as well. Well, if he's patient as well, then you have just thrown up everything into an explosion. Does that make sense?
I think that if you have, I think that aseity isn't the same as divine simplicity, is it?
Well, so they're directly related. They're not the exact same thing, but an ase being must be simple, because if he is made up of parts, then he is not the God, but the parts, because everything that's made up of parts is not what it is until the parts are put together. The example that Dr. Dolezal gives is a Lego man. You know, you say, you got a Lego man. How does a Lego man start out? It starts with a bunch of parts on a conveyor belt and you put them together. And he had a Darth Vader in the lectures. And he said, you know, and you can take off that Darth Vader's arm and he'll still be Darth Vader. You can take off his leg and he'll still be Darth Vader. You take off his head, suddenly he probably stops being Darth Vader at that point. But at some point he's going to lose his being as to what he is. But he is not what he is except for the parts that make him up. So if you want to say God is self-existent, and yet he's made up of parts, he's not simple, then the parts themselves are really what's divine. And then, but then when you have parts, you've got to have them assemble into a coherent whole. So whatever those parts or whatever assembles those parts into the complex being is God. And it just kind of collapses, doesn't make any sense.
I'm not really sure that it does, to be honest. He's only divine if you don't see him as, or he's only God is only God if he's not seen as having different parts.
Yes, if he has parts, then God is not God. The parts that make God, remember I said simplicity is nothing outside of God makes God to be God. All right, and if he's made up of parts, it's the parts that are really the deity, because that's what he depends upon to be who he is.
How do you talk about the relationship between Jesus and God then? Between things like the Holy Spirit and God then?
Well, those are delineations of personhood within the one being of God.
How is that not, I mean, you're saying they're delineations. What do you mean by that?
There's distinction, and they're eternal distinctions within that one being or essence.
But isn't that how you identify parts?
No, because parts are necessarily related to becoming. In other words, something happens. There's no ontological happening within the Trinity.
Yeah, but there's a happening within the actions of the parts of the Trinity. Like the Holy Spirit comes into people when they come to know God and sensus divinitatis, for example, and
Yes.
Jesus he became a contingent being. These are actions that I don't think are sustainable if you think God is divinely simple.
Well, those are ad extra actions, not ad intra actions.
What's that do
Ad
for
extra is
it?
going to be how God relates to contingency in the contingent world, and it involves analogical language. Ad intra is who God is in and of himself, and it involves no change. It's perfection, and again, it's not something that we can even understand because there's no predication before there was creation.
But it seems like you could just say that about anything when you get in a tight spot. You could say, well, it's not something we understand.
Well, no, but do you agree that if it is true that there's something that is self-existent, that there must be use of analogical language? In other words, because, for example, a deity, perfect being that does not begin, cannot be shared, because the moment you share it, it just became something. So do you agree that there are in some sense, there's got to be some kind of accommodative language? Because it's incommunicable
Because
by
you can,
definition.
so, but presumably when you're making an analogy, there's something that's similar between the two things you're making an analogy. They're not the same thing, but there's a similar attribute that you can make sense of. But every time we try and talk about God in terms of an analogy, whenever I try to identify the similar thing that makes the analogy coherent, it gets, well, that's just a mystery. We can't tell.
Well, then,
Like,
yeah, that's
okay,
what analogical language is. We cannot use univocal language, because that which is incommunicable cannot be created that way. What we can't have is we can't have contradiction, okay? But there's got to be, I mean, just logically speaking, there's got to be some point at which there has to be mystery, because it's incommunicable.
Yeah, but you could say, I mean, but you could say that, but every time anything I identify ends up being where the mystery is.
It's gonna ultimately end in mystery. Just like somebody, for example, in the Old Testament, God would visit the people with the Shekinah glory. That was a mediated, that was a mitigated. Remember, God says, "No one has seen my face and live." In other words, God's revelation of Himself to mankind is always going to be an accommodated revelation. But just because it's accommodated doesn't mean it's not real.
I don't see how this is, like, He can interact with the world, but it's a mystery as to how that makes sense with an immutable being.
Oh no, we can't make sense of it, but we can say, because we can say that again, that which is logically repugnant, we can certainly know that for sure. For example, again, I always come back to this, that we are not self-existent. We are dependent on something for its existence. Therefore, we know that God exists. But when you get up to the top and you say, how is God, for example, God being identical with His essence and His being, and how does everything, all of His attributes, collapse into one essence? Well, I cannot comprehend that, and I can't predicate about it, because it in and of itself is not predicated.
So you can't decide, when you're talking about God's omnipotence, you're saying the same thing as if you were talking about God's omniscience.
Well, ad intra, in His being, everything must collapse into or something that is a perfect unity of such, because there's nothing changing, there's nothing becoming within that. And so, but for us to understand it, He, like I said, He refracts it into a way that we can understand. Imperfect, although true.
Okay, so it's true, but that's what the analogy would be. It's
anytime
perfect. Okay, go ahead.
Well, let's use the example of quantum mechanics. Okay, can we know anything about quantum mechanics?
I guess we can use a system that looks at it.
Okay, and we can function, at least know some things within it, even though there is a sense of mystery which we are it blows our mind away, and we haven't been able to figure it out. Now, someday we may be able to, but a lot of the skeptical friends that I have, that they'll want to say, "Oh, well, logic breaks down at the quantum level." I say, no, it doesn't. Otherwise, there's no inquiry. We don't understand it. It's mystery to us. But just because it's mysterious doesn't mean there's nothing we can know whatsoever. But we know what we can. And it may be that we never are able to figure it out. That doesn't mean that the truths that we can extrapolate from that are not real.
I mean, but people who perform quantum mechanics, people who use it to do science and stuff, they understand that that's an issue. They understand that that stops them from finding out new things, from explaining new things. Mm-hmm. So it sounds to me like, so you think this is a problem?
No, I don't.
That we're unable to figure out the mystery.
Well, I would like to know everything there is to know, wouldn't you?
Well, yeah, but the thing is that it seems to me like if it's a problem, being able to explain the attributes of God, that it seems like anything like what we started out with, the problem of evil and everything, it's a problem because you won't be able to explain how it is, how we can, how that's not really an issue.
Yeah,
But
because I'm
then
not
the
omniscient.
problem of evil is an argument, a persuasive argument, in my opinion, showing that God doesn't exist.
Which, again, in order to say that there's such a thing as evil, you're assuming a standard. So your very presupposition, in order to question it, renders your complaint invalid.
Well, remember, there's two different things. There's a standard you can assume, and that's if you can establish like some sort of moral framework. And then there's just pointing out an inconsistency with concepts.
Yes,
if you're saying that God has these attributes, then it seems inconsistent with those attributes for gratuitous pain and suffering to occur.
Yes, but what is gratuitous?
Gratuitous as in like there's no justified good reasons for God to allow such pain and suffering.
Right. So you're saying that you see evil, and then you do not think that it's a good thing. Therefore, it's too much.
It seems gratuitously unnecessary, considering all the theology, considering all the theodicies. Like, for example, you said sin earlier. It seems to me that having the collateral damage of animals going through pain and suffering happening right now is gratuitously unnecessary for the theological goal that God is trying to have with sin.
Yeah. So in other words, it seems odd to you. So you'd say, I wouldn't do it that way, therefore it's false.
It's not even I wouldn't do it that way. It's inconsistent with what I think, with the abilities of an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being.
Right. No, man, we got to redefine omnibenevolent. I wish we could just throw out omnibenevolent, because I think the whole thing would just go away.
What term would you prefer?
God is faithful to himself.
Okay, but
and your argument will completely disappear.
Yeah, but then that sounds like God is contingent on his being.
No, I'm using it as an example, as a way for us to relate and understand that God, necessarily being ase, must be non-deficient in the way that he deals with himself and everything he creates. And it's trivial. It's a trivial truth. I mean, it just follows absolutely.
Yeah, but it's still that doesn't address the issue I brought up.
The issue that you think that God does it a way that you don't think is right? I'm sorry?
He's dependent on his own being. He can't help but do anything that's consistent with his
God is not separate from his being. Remember, we got the simplicity. He doesn't have this being that's outside of him that he depends on it or something like that. He is himself.
Okay.
God is not an instantiation of some category of being, like you're an instantiation of humanity. Okay. God is not that. God just is existence.
Yeah, but why does contingency stop at things that are internal? Why can't something be contingent on the internal aspects of a being? Like I'm contingent upon different functions of my body, different like the digestion system, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't we say that? It seems to me like we're saying the same thing. God is contingent on his nature as to how he interacts with evil in the world.
I'm not sure I understand. If you're going to say that God has a nature that's different from himself on which he depends, I don't see how you can say that.
Is that what I'm saying when I say I'm contingent on like the different
now,
the circulatory system?
You are composite. You're not God. Are you a composite being?
I mean, if you define me as having different like parts and stuff, sure.
Yeah, and so I mean, I could whack my arm off and I'd still be me, but I would be less of that accidental property. That's what I mean by accidental properties. You have things about you that are not essential to your nature, but that you are dependent upon in order to exist. Like, if someone were to take my heart out, then I would cease to be me, at least as a sentient creature. And so,
but that's what you're saying about God. though, when you're saying, well, it's his nature to do this. If you stop this aspect of his nature, he would cease to be a necessary being, right? Or he would cease to be who he is. You're saying the same thing.
If our description about him is not consistent with what must be, then he would not be God. What I'm saying.
I'm not sure I follow that. If it's, is there another way you could put that maybe?
When we're thinking about God, there are certain things that we say about him that are logically repulsive, that would nullify his aseity, okay? And it would make the idea of God to be logically repulsive. So we cannot affirm those things about him. But I'm not saying that God, I don't know, it's so hard to talk about. That's why, negative theology is the heart of theology proper, because all we can do is look at ourselves and say what he is not. Eminentiae, via eminentiae, is the other one I was thinking of. God is the perfection. Yeah, eminence, everything he is. He's most perfect, he's most good, he's most holy. That's what our confessions say. I'm sorry, I was trying to, it came to my mind right there.
Yeah.
But negative theology is at the heart of what we are required to do, because that is something that we are not. We've got to make affirmations by way of negation of what we experience toward the way of perfection.
What was that supposed to answer exactly? What you're saying that this is why
you're saying that God has something
on
in his nature. That, I'm sorry?
Okay. This is why God isn't just dependent on his nature. This is why God's nature isn't really doing all the work.
Yeah, it's almost like you're saying like God has these compartments within himself. There's God, and then there's his nature that is in addition to who God is.
I'm not seeing how, and this allows us to speak of mystery when we can't address the fact that there's gratuitous evil in the world.
But that's the whole point in question. How do you come to the point that there's gratuitous evil?
Well, it sounds to me like you're just appealing to like skeptical theism at that point. You're saying I'm not sure whether or not it's gratuitous because we don't have access.
I am sure because of my argument's always going to go back to an ontological one. I am sure because of God, who God is, that there's not one modicum of gratuitous evil.
Well, presumably you would be able to explain why it's not gratuitous, though.
Well, you're presupposing my view in order to make the complaint.
Not necessarily. The one thing I'm presupposing is that you can identify inconsistencies, right?
An inconsistency is bad.
An inconsistency is bad in this situation, sure.
Okay, you're assuming that then, right? In other words, inconsistency is sin from my perspective.
Well, the thing you're saying, what is it you're saying exactly? I'm assuming that there's a standard by which to decide which is bad, which is good?
Yes. And to not conform to that standard is bad.
I don't see why you're pointing that out, but what's that do to the issue?
Your presupposition at the beginning of the argument eviscerates your complaint.
Well, why does me pointing out something that would be bad in your standard make the complaint moot? Don't you still have to deal with the bad thing?
No, because you're assuming that it's bad.
Well, I'm assuming that it's bad on your standard.
Right.
If you don't think it's bad on
your standard is that it's bad.
But it sounds to me like it would be bad if God has no reason to allow like horrible suffering on your standard, right?
Right. Inconsistency is sinful, is what you're saying. And I'm saying, how do you justify that standard?
I mean, the thing is, I don't have to, if it's something that's bad on your standard, then we could just deal with it on your standard. Why is it that God would allow such horrendous pain and suffering? It's a problem for your standard.
It's not a problem for my standard at all.
Why
Again,
not?
I'm going to go back to an ontological argument and say that God, I may not understand it. It may seem difficult to me, but just because I say that I wouldn't do it that way, because if I were God and think about how small I am, that's kind of a silly thing to say.
You're just appealing to skeptical theism, though. You're saying, look, I don't know. I mean, it's not whether or not you would be able to think of something. It's that you cannot think of anything, any justified good
Oh,
reasons
no.
that God would
Remember, we
have.
started out, I can think of reasons in my life where, in fact, I've had some significance. Well, to me, it was significant. Maybe to others, it wouldn't be, in my life. And it has worked to my benefit marvelously. It made me a much better person. And like I said, every movie you go to see that. You go to see evil, the struggle with evil, and you want to see the triumph of good.
But then
So,
you are limiting God in that extent. You're saying that God couldn't allow these good things to occur in people's lives unless horrible things like the Holocaust, like the millions of people killed by Stalin and all those people occurred.
yeah. Well, let me give you a quote from Jonathan Edwards. He said, "How can God be happy and decree calamity? Well, consider that he has the capacity to view the world through two lenses. Through the narrow one, he's both grieved and angered at sin and suffering. But through the wide one, he sees evil in view of its eternal purposes. Like a mosaic, the individual is ugly, but the whole is beautiful."
There's another way maybe I can approach it to show you the issue with this.
Okay.
Stephen Law also has the evil God challenge,
Mm-hmm.
which it takes all these theodicies that are being thrown in, reverses them. It seems to me like someone who can affirm that there's an evil God that exists could just say what you said, but the reverse. Like you go, look at puppies being born, babies being adorable, all that stuff. All this good is actually to allow for a greater evil. And we could take the John Edwards quote that you've made, and just change the words around in order to support the existence of an evil God.
Okay.
But that's clearly not the God that you're trying to support, right?
But evil then would just, you would be defining God as a contingent by definition with such a thing.
How so?
Because he's denying himself. Evil. How could God allow? He would be fallible in that he could not do what he wanted to do. Evil would be an affront against his own being. How could that be? He would be contingent.
It would be an affront against the God that you're talking about. I'm talking about a God that has all the attributes. My God is perfectly evil. He's the perfection of evil.
Okay, evil is the negation of the good. It's not a positive attribute. It's a negation of the good.
Yeah, but how do you talk? I mean, you're saying that you use negative theology to talk about God. So yes. Presumably, a negative attribute isn't. I mean,
it's a lack of an attribute. I'm saying that it's like Richard Dawkins saying that God cannot change his mind, therefore, and I can change my mind, therefore I'm better than God. Greg Koukl does this. It's hilarious. To be able to change your mind does mean that you made a mistake. There's something you didn't understand and you change your mind. It's not a perfection. It's a weakness. And that's what you're doing right now, saying, oh, well, if God could just deny himself, then
How is he denying himself again? I don't see that. How is he denying himself by saying that instead of God being perfectly good, he's perfectly evil? How is it being a negative attribute make it so being the perfection of that attribute isn't possible?
Okay, because evil is a deprivation of good. And if God is a deprivation, then he is a contingent by something outside of him. There's a standard of good outside of him that he doesn't meet. He is the epitome of contingency.
But I don't see why you can't just say the reverse, that good is just a deprivation of evil.
Good is just a deprivation of evil?
Yeah, good is just a lack of evil.
The existence, everything's going to be determined by existence, okay? So evil destroys or diminishes existence. Would you agree with that?
I don't see, I mean, destroying the existence of something bad would be a good thing, right?
That which, everything that's good you're going to talk about is that which enhances the sanctity of existence, is what I always say.
Can you repeat that again? I saw your cat in the background. So
That's my dog.
okay.
Every decision that you make on a moral stance is going to be focused and centralized toward the goal of existence. Okay. So, for example, evil for you, in a way you're defining it right now, is the destruction of human life. We all have this determination within us. We have been determined to value existence. And when we don't see existence, that's why we're having this whole conversation. We're following this determination that we have. When somebody diminishes existence, when somebody murders people with a hatchet, we say they are broken. And we're assuming that there is something, the sanctity of existence. So what you're saying is some God who could, he himself is existence, yet he glories in the destruction of existence. He's denying himself by definition.
There's a couple things. I'm not talking about evil in terms of us. I'm talking about evil in terms of perfect evil. So we're talking about evil in terms of how God is evil.
What is evil? I mean,
God can be perfectly evil.
Perfect evil is the abomination
this kind of incredulity, though, is it's the same thing I could say towards God being perfectly good, especially since I have plenty of evidence showing that there are things that a perfectly good God wouldn't allow.
Okay, again, you appeal to just because I wouldn't do it that way, therefore it's wrong.
It's not me again. Remember, I never said it's something I wouldn't do.
How do you determine something being bad then? It's a sanctity of existence.
Something. It seems to me like, okay, if something were, I mean, you can have just something being like occurring, not like being destroyed, not being like obliterated, still existing. That's evil. Perpetuating the life of someone who commits evil can be seen
evil?
as
destroying existence, right? Evil is destroying existence, right?
It wouldn't be evil to destroy that human being, though. Then.
Because he is destroying existence.
I'm sorry?
Right? It wouldn't be wrong to destroy that evil that's destroying existence because he's destroying existence. You're assuming the sanctity of existence in everything that you say.
I don't see how that negates the issue that I'm bringing up, though.
Okay, listen, Joe, I need to get going.
I don't see. Okay.
Is it okay if we wind it down? I've got a ton of studying. I got a class I got to teach tomorrow, and I haven't really done any preparation for it.
Sure.
And
yeah, definitely.
Okay. Well, this is one of the most fruitful discussions I've ever had, Joe.
Yeah.
You are very intelligent and very adult in your interaction, unlike so many of the people that I interact with. I mean, it's just, I'm so impressed that you know so much about William Lane Craig and about.
You might want to talk with who are called the Pal Talkers here. They know a lot more about this kind of stuff. There's this person named Jack. They all have that black belt symbol. They know a lot about this kind of stuff.
Are they Christian?
No, they're not. They're the ones, but they know a lot about Craig. One of the reasons why is because Craig, despite his flaws in his views, he's very good at explaining this kind of stuff to more people.
Uh-huh.
But sorry, I just read something in the live chat and made me laugh. But Coffee Smug's also good, but he rarely comes into the hangouts. He knows a lot about this stuff as well. Okay. He can engage you on the morality of this kind of stuff. But I think you should talk to those people as well, because they know about aseity, they know that kind of stuff.
Uh-huh.
Well, maybe I can get you in contact with them.
That'd be great. And see, here's the thing, Joe, is what I love it when there is an exchange of ideas back and forth. So I'm talking to you, and you're listening to what I'm saying, and you're talking to me, and I'm trying to hear what you're saying too, and there's actually some pretty thoughtful interaction rather than just trying to win an argument or whatever. But and you're very like I said, adulting your interaction. So that's very helpful and very enjoyable to interact with you. So thank you for that.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Definitely. We'll definitely do this again sometime then.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good.
All right. Cool.
All right. Bless you. We'll see you.